Hello and good morning friends, welcome to CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you all know that we have been discussing on women's studies in our previous lectures. Today we are going to discuss on women issues in India, and for this we have with us in our studios Dr. Aprajita Kashyap. She is Assistant Professor in University School of Law and Legal Studies, Guru Gobind Singh Indraprasth University. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Aprajita Kashyap, and through her we are going to know more about the women issues in India. Hello ma'am, welcome to the EDICIT lectures.
Thank you so much.
These are sessions of ours. In previous lectures also we have been talking a lot about the women's studies, but as the topic today is the women issues in India. Women is considered in very different phases in our country. So what are those issues which are prominent in India?
Yeah, I would just like to bring your attention to the women issues, and because it's a vast area, so I would only be touching upon certain areas. And welcome viewers. Today's issue is focused, my lecture would be focused, I'm going to structure my lecture in a particular way. And before I start my lecture, the key areas that I would be focusing on are women in Indian society. I'll be giving you a rough idea of the patriarchy, the entitlements, the division of labor. Then going on to women in Indian politics, and I'm tracing three phases: pre-independence, then post-independence from 1947 to 1980 and 1980s onwards. And I would be looking then towards the various women's movement in all the spheres, and how women and women's organization have been making impact in the movements in India. There's one area, violence against women, which I'm not going to touch upon in great details, but these are the key areas related to women's problem. Then how women have formed institutions or groups to empower themselves, or how has the government taken certain efforts to empower the women. And in this, the most important thing that we have to look up is how women are viewed in development issues, and there it is pertinent to talk about the self-help group movements, the issues of microfinance. So now beginning my lecture with, let's just giving a brief outline of what is feminism. And if we look at the dictionary definition of feminism, it says the theory of political, economic and social equality of the sexes. And then we recognize feminist leaders, according to the definition meaning, as those people who have organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. So the feminist leaders are not necessarily women, they could be men also. And having defined feminism, it is important to quote Cynthia Enloe, who had asked a very pertinent question. She often raised this question, where are the women? And if we look at where the women are, we come across certain glaring situations in the society. One is that they are excluded from power and politics, and it could be a natural consequence of their biology, and they are considered only as contributing indirectly. They are contributing as laborers, as companions, but we fail to measure their contributions in terms of direct inputs. Now, as I've already told you, the key areas that we are going to take up would be subsequently discussed in the course of the lecture, but the problem areas that if we see in India are most important are gender related violence. Then you have problems of right to education. Then equal pay for equal work is another problem area. Then how women have been traditionally excluded from the decision making process, be it the political sphere or be it their private sphere, and how even in terms of planning their adult life, in terms of marriage or childbearing, they have very little say. We know how it's a son-centric society. For begetting a son, a woman may be asked to bear children one after the other. So these are kind of decisions on which women have no control. It's the society which determines. Now, women movement in India women have been empowered. I will not say that women in India have not have a good status or good standing in the society. They have been there, but if we go to concretizing the efforts towards women's empowerment, they were far and few, and whatever was happening in India had a genesis in many of the worldwide movements. So if we look at the worldwide movements, the various phases of feminism, it started during second wave of feminism that we started actually concretizing women's association, women's rights, and then we had the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talked about equal rights for men and women, and all this was recognized in the ECOSOC. ECOSOC is the only peace related institution or organ of the United Nations, and it was talking about societal issues and specifically women's contribution to the society and to the economy. 1970s was a major year because there were certain women's NGOs, specific NGOs which came up, and they started talking about how as a result of development women had been excluded from certain areas, especially access to resources. They were asked to do additional work. Their contributions were often ignored. The issues of women's health or their right to safety in workplace, all these issues were just ignored. And 76 and 85 in the world movement is a major leap because that was declared the International Decade for Women. And the entire decade then was devoted to asking for empowerment of women, for better societal status, and because the discrimination against women had been majorly highlighted, and the governments in the different worlds and many of the international organizations, they realized that piecemeal efforts were not enough. So we had to do something for a longish period, and that would concretize efforts towards empowering the women, and the declaration of the Decade for Women was a case in point. Now, narrowing down to feminism in India, if we look at feminism in India, there are certain unique features which we have to identify. The first unique feature was, ironically, it were the men who initiated social reform movements against all the social evils. We have Raja Ram Mohan Roy who was working in West Bengal. Then we had Maharshi Karve in Maharashtra. So all, if we look at a thread which is running, is that the initial movement for women's betterment or women's empowerment was started by men. Then the second unique feature is that the heterogeneity of India reveals multiple patriarchies and multiple feminisms. So we cannot say for sure that this region talks about that there's a uniform treatment meted out to women, or there is a uniform realization that women have been discriminated. It is not so. There is a heterogeneous pattern in different parts of India. For example, in Kerala, the women have always been empowered. There are certain areas like Rajasthan and Haryana where the women have been discriminated, and so much so that female feticide is quite rampant in those areas. So we have to say that there are multiple issues, multiple aspects in multiple areas. So this is unique feature of India. There is not a single theoretical orientation. We cannot say that this theory can be picked up and applied in totality to India. This is one problem. Now, the other unique feature is that it has changed over time in relation to historical and cultural realities. So, the feminist movement in India has evolved. Maybe it became progressive at times, it became regressive at times, because if we look at the status of women during the Vedic periods, it appears that women in India were more evolved. Therefore, we cannot say that everything, as time is progressing, the women's movement has progressed. No, it has regressed at times. Therefore, it is not constant. There has been change in time and efforts in the women related approaches in India, and these all have historical and cultural basis. Then there has been a change in movement because of the level of consciousness of the people, how it has varied over time. Although it's nothing to do with education, because for example, if we look at the Chipko movement, it's not about educated ladies who were taking up the movement, but consciousness is different from education or literacy. And if we look at another unique feature is that we have to see in India that we moved above the idea, the notion that women as individuals. Now there were certain areas where women as groups had to be treated, because India is a caste centric society. There are it's a stratified society. So taking cases of individual women would not suffice, because if we were talking about individual women, then the most people who would benefit would be urban women and educated women and women in high position. But we did not choose that. We chose to look at women as a group. Now, going ahead with feminism in India, if we look at the pre-independence feminist movements or the feminist leaders, they largely accepted the sexual division of labor, because they said that women were biologically different. And so their role in industrialization or their role in labor intensive industries had to be different from men. This was the first premise. Now 70s, the feminists, we even went to the extent of pointing out that many injustices that were accruing to the women were because of the sexual division of labor. And this realization also accrues that why should we discriminate, whereas there are certain qualities in women which make them special, especially if we look at the role of women. Women are more nurturing and peaceful. This is a universal rule. Women values are important in politics and ecology, because if because of the ecological movements or ecological impacts, it is the women who are most intricately attached, or it is the women who are going to be affected. For example, if we have scarcity of water, it is the women who have to travel more distance to fetch that water. So women's intricate involvement with nature is also very important. And some of the feminists have gone to the extent of saying that men must imbibe women's nurturing skill, and saying this would be a far-fetched idea, because in terms of war, it is said that the European men during the medieval periods, they were more wanting to show their prowess in wars because they lacked the nurturing skill, and to show that they were more powerful in other areas, they would feel it was a pride to get involved in war. And position of women was always unequal because of the patriarchal society in India, and the patriarchy was so deeply entrenched that it was difficult to seek equality for women. But this is not a generalization. This is not a rule, because in Northeast or in Kerala, for example, we have matrilineal societies. So we are not talking about exceptions, but we are talking about rules. Now if we look, now we'll be looking at the social aspect, the economic aspect, and the political aspect of women's movement, of women's issues in India. So let's first consider the social status. Now if you look at the social status, there are certain things that we have to keep in mind. One aspect of social status is religion, which is very important. Second is the caste, and the third is class. But if we look at caste and class, they are so intricately woven in India that it is difficult to say that this is caste and this is class. So I would just reserve consideration of women in the caste or class strata. Now if you look at religious patriarchy, the women were made to accept gender oppression through religion, which raises many questions regarding the location of women in religion. Did they have the right to read the scriptures? Did they have to have the right to enter temples? Did they have the right to enter temples on particular days of the month? And could they become priests? Could they be performing ceremonies like men do? So these were certain issues which the religious arena faced related to women. Now the women started resisting. They started resisting the religious based issues which were trying to build up the discrimination and to widen the gap between men and women. And they started all this movement at their own initiative, because naturally the religious institutions were not supporting them, because they wanted to retain the entrenched hierarchy. And this was a problem, because women had to first fight the men and then ask for concessions. The caste system, if we look at, the caste system is another source of inequality in India. For example, it's not about just the upper class or the Dalits, but I've just taken an example of the Dalit women. But even within the upper caste, the women had to observe the parda system. The higher Kshatriya class or the warrior class, they had the system of sati, they had the sati pratha, they had johar. So it would be a folly to say that women were discriminated only in the lower classes. It wasn't that. So if we look at the caste as source of inequality in India, then there were many movements which had started and to oppose the oppression. For example, the Mahila Samta Sainik Dal, it was formed by the Dalit women and recognized religion as the major reason for oppression of the Dalit women. So this is one example. There are many more examples in India. Now, because of these social issues, then any issue, for example, be it social issue, political issue, economic issue, the most important aspect and the most important method of dealing with all these discrimination are the legal methods. For example, having said that there were efforts towards empowerment of women, but till these efforts were concretized, till they were codified or given a legal status, in case of violation there were not definite punishments. So we had to look for ways that all these discriminations and the methods to do away with the discriminations were somehow codified, or they were given a legal backing so that it was easier to remove the discrimination. If you look at the legal issues, the first thing that we have to look at is liberal equality. That is, equality must treat, because we talk about liberalism talks about individualism and liberal individualism, but if you look at many of the European countries, the enfranchisement for women came very late in many of the European societies. For example, Switzerland as late as 1970 started giving the suffrage rights to women. So liberal equality in terms of equality in economic sphere, in social sphere, in political sphere had to be brought about, and what better way than enacting laws. The second was not only asking for equality, there were certain areas in which we had to seek dominance, because the discrimination had suppressed us. So to come up, we had to be put at a position of dominance. So there were certain legal provisions which wanted to prove the dominance or to entrench the dominance of women. For example, there were laws to protect women's interest. There were certain reservations for women through which they could get a sizable position or sizable proportion representation. The rights of inheritance started being changed. So the family laws, the rules of inheritance were being changed so that women were given more stress and were given more power in terms of inheriting the paternal or ancestral properties. Then empowerment meant right of all women. We were not looking at empowering the select few or the elite women, but empowerment, if it had a constitution guarantee, it would mean the empowerment of all the different sections of the society. And one thing that we have to bear in mind, and why I emphasize on legal issues, is that even if it is social acceptance, but without rules or laws on gender equality, implementation becomes difficult, and the realization of actual equality of women in society is impossible. So legal issues are very, very important. And in legal issues there are two things. One, you start looking from the perspective of the women. The second important thing is that you have women in those positions who are into lawmaking, or you have judges, or you have parliamentarians. So parliamentarians would legislate, and the judges in the judiciary would adjudicate in terms of violation of rules against women. So these are some of the legal issues which became very important. Now if we move on to the second arena of women's issue, and that arena are called the economic arena. These are the economic issues that women have to face. Now important thing about women is that, women, the economic empowerment of women is a thing on which we have been silent, because women as a household entity, their contribution has not been accounted in the national budget. So they are supposed to be living off the salaries or the earnings of their husbands, and whereas their contribution towards the household is not accounted for. So we just belittle the contribution of housewives to how the family is brought up, or to how the household is kept running. This is why there has been a move to account for the contribution of women in the household. Now what areas became very important economically were the issues of social security, because if it is a welfare government, there are certain welfare schemes, and that includes women as an important factor. Now if the government started cutting back on social security because of liberalization, and they started removing the state provisions which were supporting women, because they thought they had done enough after 1947, and 1990s, when we start talking about liberalization, the notion was that we have done enough for the women's movement, and we need to roll back those securities or subsidies or special measures or special provisions that the government had provided. The other thing was that poverty was being feminized. The idea was floated that women were responsible for the poverty, and the subsequent realization was also that because of poverty, it is the women who suffer. So they were the cause of poverty, and they were the effects of poverty as well. Now they were not the effect, they bore the effects of poverty. Now employment of women, now in the labor sector, what started happening was, because women were not paid equal wages for equal work, so it was easier to employ women in the different menial labors, because they thought that if they were paying 66 rupees per day to men, they could get away with paying 47 rupees to women. And if men were voicing more concerns regarding their rights, women were more meek, they would not raise their voice. So the employers thought it convenient always to employ women. They were cheap and marginalized labor force. And the flow of women workers also started once there were opportunities in the urban areas because of infrastructure development. Then the women folk, which were traditionally required to stay in the villages and help in nurturing the families, they started flocking to the urban centers, and this rural urban migration became rampant, and the major component of this rural urban migration were the women. So we started looking at empowering women. How do we empower them? So there were certain constitutional provisions, like there was a fundamental right, equal pay for equal work. Then there were certain seats which were reserved for women. Then women were given certain special benefits, like For example, in recent times, the government has has extended the maternity leave. They have started the special 2-year childcare leave in the government sector. So there were efforts being made. The problem is not the efforts being made. The problem is the implementation, and the problem is that these are piecemeal efforts. They don't address the root cause of the problem. They address the problems superficially. So one important area in which women have been economically empowered and are taking the lead are these self-help groups. These self-help groups are very, very important, especially if you look at Uttarakhand and Rajasthan. So these are self-help groups, and the idea behind self-help groups are that 10 to 20 rural women from the same village, mostly poor, would get together and they would contribute their savings either fortnightly or monthly, and this would become a corpus of fund, and this fund then would be distributed to anybody who needs finance. And the loans maybe mostly are provided to the members within the group, but at times the financing is done also to the outside people. These self-help groups are generally facilitated by NGOs, and they train and advise the members in a variety of on and off farm income generating activities. So it's not only about giving fund, they are also helping them in income generation. So they advise certain areas, they give you novel out of box ideas where women then can start earning, and then this income generates more income, and this way they are able to pay off many of the land loans. Microfinancing is one important area in which these SHGs have been contributing, and microfinancing is very, very important area, especially as I told you in Uttarakhand, and at least I know of one, Sahastradhara, who has been actively working towards microfinancing in women issues. Now, if we expand economic issues to the larger issue of development, because development is not only about economics, development is about economics, about environment, it's about societal changes, it's about politics. So, if we look at how women have been viewed in the development scheme, we have to look at a couple of approaches. The first approach is called the liberal approach, which proposes to integrate women more equally into development. So the liberal approach basically says men and women are equal, so any development areas must consider women as equal to men. Then there are other approaches as well. There are other approaches which say that the women have to have special status. For example, the women need to be empowered because development does not see them as equal partners. Then development at times is also damaging to women, and they also say that whenever we talk about Human Development Index, this is the indicator which has the United Nations felt that only assessing the GDP of a country was not enough. So we needed to incorporate certain other criteria like life expectancy, their educational level into income accounting, and this is why there was a new concept which came up, the Human Development Index, which measures your life expectancy at birth, educational attainment, your standard of living. And there have been feminists, developmental feminists, who have gone on to argue that instead of GDI, why don't we have the HDI, why don't we have something called Gender Development Index, in which we take into account the women's contribution. And this GDI will have adjustments in disparity between men and women. So it's like Human Development Index, and they say that just saying human is men biased or male biased. So we should have Gender Development Index in which the concession or handicap for women's developmental role should be provided. Now we from the economics, then we move on to another area which is a very important area. This is called the political arena, and it is important to assess political arena at great depth, because the politicians are they are responsible for decision making, be it the economic sphere, be it the social sphere, or be it the legal sphere. So the women in politics have a very important role, because once you make them very active or you make their presence felt in the political arena, they can the leaders can take care of different issues. So if I would like to quote here a couple of political thinkers, Kant, he went to want to say that women's inability to control their emotions and their inability to be impartial or rational requires their exclusion from political participation. So women are treated as irrational beings, and one of the biggest, Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, Locke went on to say that men were rational, and when he said men, now we realize, having read this, that men meant men, the male, and whereas the interpretation should have been men and women, so it should have been human are rational. And this is one issue why a lot of people have reservations, that what is their inability that makes them partial or irrational, and why should they then, on this basis of being partial and irrational, be excluded from political participation. If we look at Rawls and Habermas, they took up notion of reason which allows impartiality and autonomy. Since women were dependent and connected with nature, emotion and physical weakness, their ability to give laws to themselves and act impartially was seriously in question. So you see how we have over the ages been questioning the rationality and impartiality of women, and that is why we want to preclude them from political arena. Now, if we look at, having talked about the thinkers, it's not that the countries have gone ahead and just believed in what Rawls had to say or what Kant had to say. No, we have done certain things. We have tried to incorporate women and try to negate the fact that they were irrational, or they were irrational, or they lacked reason. And now there were certain. So how do we incorporate women in politics? First of all, we had to remove some of the structural barriers. And how do we remove the structural barriers? These are removal of discriminatory laws and institutions that limit the women to run for office or to vote. So the first structural barrier was the right to vote. So enfranchisement was one way in which this structural barrier could be removed. Thankfully, in India, we are far advanced in terms of enfranchisement of women. Now, there are certain posts, there are certain positions, there are certain constituencies in which women were absent. They were not allowed to run for office. So you had to do away with all those areas. Then the second barrier was their capacity gap, that because of the lack of education, because of the lack of impartiality, because of the lack of reason, women couldn't become effective leaders. So we had to exclude them from assuming leadership roles. Now, it's not only that. It's just not about barriers. There were certain political ideologies which said that women had certain advantages, and we had to take those advantages or those qualities of women and make them as important structure in foreign policy making. For example, I would like to quote liberalism, which advised the integration of women into the realm of foreign policy making. They said the liberalists viewed women as more effective in conflict resolution and decision making because innately they are peace lovers. And at household also they are involved in so many conflict situations. They always have to make a choice, be it resources, be it family gatherings, or be it behaving in a particular way. So they always have to make choices, and in making choices they seem to appear as peace loving. So the liberalists were right in assigning a role in decision making, and that was of conflict resolution. They feel that their inclusion would give a better pool of diplomats, soldiers and politicians, and they do not negate the unique contribution of women as peacemakers. Now, all this led to the emergence of women's movement in India, and the women's movement in India has a very unique characteristic. The composition of the women's movement, the agenda, the form and style, its outreach and inclusiveness, these have been changing over the years, and when I trace the three phases, it will become evident. For example, if you look at the social reform movement before independence, this was strictly restricted to the condition of women in the upper caste, and there were certain very aberrations and aberration and certain practices against which these women movements were raising their heads. One issue was child marriage, the other was sati, others were the kind of treatment that was being meted out to widows in different societies. So these were only a few aberrations, and these issues were being taken up by the social reform movements. But one thing that was very apparent was that even if they were working towards the empowerment of women or to the betterment of women's social status, the aim was clear. The aim was to retain the edifice of the traditional patriarchal society, and so the edifice or the stratification of the society would be untouched, but certain aberrations would be taken care of. So they were not talking about women in general, they were talking about women issues in particular. Now then, but we cannot negate the contribution of women in the nationalist movement. The nationalist movement saw very prominent women, and they were doing things beyond the expected roles that women of those times were having. And then in 1949, the constitution, it explicitly laid certain provisions which were pro-women, and this was a clear indication that the politicians and the ideology of the politicians was changing, and they wanted women to be more equally represented in the Indian society, the independent Indian society. But one thing was very, very apparent, that political parties for women were lacking in India. There was a women's conference within the Congress, and if we look at the other parties, they just lacked political representation to women. But thankfully the Communist Party, women were very proactive, and that was one aberration. The only party-based women's organization in the late 70s was the Mahila Dakshata Samiti. It was founded by the socialist women in the Janata Party as late as 1977. Now, there was another perception that it was only the urban, educated, elite women who were taking up who were involved in women's movement. But one movement of that time negated this notion, and this was that the development of feminist consciousness was taking in rural areas also, and this was evident in the Telangana movement in Andhra Pradesh, and especially Karimnagar district. So the movement had moved from being city centric, urban centric to rural centric, and there were it wasn't only about national movements. We had All India Women's Conference, we had the MSD, but there were certain regional movements related to women's identity, and these movements were becoming very important. If we look at Hyderabad, the POW, comprising women from the Maoist movement, recognized the sexual division of labor, and now they start explaining the discrimination or oppression against women in terms of the Marxist theory of base and superstructure. They recognize the sexual division of labor, the base, and the cultural rationalization of it as the superstructure, and these base and superstructure then became the primary cause of women's oppression. Now, if we move to Maharashtra, in Maharashtra also there were certain movements within the Maoist outfit or within the Maoist ideology, and in Pune we had the Purogami Stri Sangathan, Progressive Women's Organization, in Bombay the Stri Mukti Sangathan, Women's Liberation Organization. So after 1970 we see that there are regional organizations of women which are becoming important. So from national we moved to regional, and then there were also local initiatives taken by the women. For example, I would like to quote Banga Mahila Samaj and the Ladies Theosophical Society at local levels in Bengal. They were promoting our modern ideals for women. Then there were Stri Mandals or Mahila Parishad at very, very local levels. Maybe a village would take it up. And so we had three levels of movements in India. We had the national movement related to women's issues, we had regional movements related to women's issue, and we had local movements. And if we analyze all the movements, it is very, very evident that the local groups were the most effective, because it was easier to mobilize women at local levels because their outlook was similar, they had similar problems. So mobilization of local women and then making it a cohesive movement was much easier than having a national movement. Regional was still better, but a national movement we had problems because we could not identify. At the outset only I said there were certain problems with India, that there were different regional perceptions, then there were different regional problems. So national movement had a limitation as far as India was concerned. Then having said the important things like economics, the social, the political aspects, we cannot negate the role of academia in women's movement. If you look at the academia, we had certain university based feminist discussion groups, and DU and JNU, for example, they had very active feminist groups. They were discussing issues, they were having conferences and seminars, and uniquely most of them did not have any party affiliation. So this was an important case in point. Then we had certain centers which were coming up, and these centers were dedicated to women's studies. For example, CWDS in Delhi was one. Then within the universities we had research units. We had research units dedicated to women specific topics or areas, and SNDT Women's University in Mumbai was the first to start this process. Now then there were other areas in which the movements were proliferating, from the typecast roles of economic, social, political ones. We were starting employment groups that would empower the women and give them some employment at the same time. We had employment groups like SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association. Then we had environmental movements like the Chipko movement, which was a Bhavri Devi's movement, and it was a very, very sorry, it wasn't Bhavri Devi. The Chipko movement was a women-centric movement, which these contractors, they wanted to take away logs from the forests in Uttarakhand, Chamoli district, and these women they started hugging a tree. That's why the name Chipko, and they would say that rather kill me before killing the tree or cutting down the tree. So women were the most important factors in the Chipko movement. Then we had literary movements. And how did we go about with literary movements? We had magazines and journals which were only women specific academic writings. So we had journals devoted to promoting women's equality, and it was not only in the English or Hindi, it was in vernacular or regional language also. For example, we had Feminist Network being published from Bombay in English. We had Ahalya, Sabala, Sachetana and Pratibadi Chetna being published from Calcutta in Bengali. Then we had Baiza from Pune in Marathi, Women's Voice in English from Bangalore, Stree Sangharsh from Patna in Hindi, and the most important literary activity of that time was Manushi, which was being published in Hindi from Delhi. And these would talk about women-centric issues, how women were treated in society, how women, normal readers would find these magazines very stimulating and very empowering. Now, if we look at now, having taken up all the issues, what is the common thread which is running between all the women's movement? And these become the agenda of women's movement. If we look at the agenda of women's movement, the first agenda was creation of public opinion. So one example of mobilization of public opinion in media is the movement against sati in Deorala in Rajasthan, where Roop Kanwar in the mid-80s was forced to commit sati. So how women groups had been involved in stimulating the reactions against this kind of a practice, that became important. Second agenda for women's movement was they wanted certain reforms in the existing laws. They said that laws were not women centric. There were certain clauses in the laws which needed amendment, and one example of reform was the rape law, which was, there was an amendment, and this amendment placed the onus of proof of innocence on the accused rapist. There were campaign against contraceptives. For example, there was a special contraceptive called Nathan, and this was an injectable contraceptive, and there was a fear that in the family planning procedure this would be used on women without their knowledge or their consent. So there was a campaign against Nathan. Then there were campaigns for uniform civil code, because different laws had, different religions had different laws. So the women were the most vociferous actors in the movement for uniform civil code, because they said that certain religions had discriminatory laws for women. So we needed a uniform law all over India. Now the women also reacted to commercialization and portrayal of women's bodies in media and advertising. There was a lot of advertisements which had to be taken out. There was a famous shoe advertisement, then there were contraceptive advertisements, and these would, and even now we have certain deodorant advertised in which women have protested and they had to be taken off air. So these agendas then started getting reflected in institution buildings or in plans or programs. So what were the important institutions and programs which reflected and took care of the agenda of the women's movement in India? 1974, there was a Towards Equality report prepared by the Committee on the Status of Women, and this was the first important report which exposed the glaring problems that women in India were facing. Then there was another convention held on the abolition of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW. Then 1975 onwards, in concurrence with the International Decade for Women, India also started taking measures for the upliftment of women. Then there were certain organizations which were already there. I would not say that they were new organizations, they were already there, but these organizations were strengthened, they were revitalized, new forces were infused in these organizations. Organizations like IDWA, All India Democratic Women's Association. There was Center for Women's Development Studies, National Federation of Working Women, Joint Women's Program, National Commission for Women, and YWCA. These were revitalized. Then there was a National Perspective Plan which was formulated for promoting women's education, health status, and political participation. This was a big leap, because on the pattern of, you have the national plans or the 5-year plans, you had a national perspective plan for women. So this was a big leap forward, where you were only dedicating a planned perspective to women. Now these women were attacked by groups outside the ruling party, and because it was accused, there was an accusation that these were only touching upon superficial problems, and they were not going into the deep cause of women's oppression. Now then we had the Central Social Welfare Board, CSWB, which was established in 1953, and it promotes the voluntary efforts for the welfare of women. Then we have the Ministry of Welfare, which gives grants to welfare organizations or for activities like construction of working women's hostel in cities. And in all this, we cannot negate the contribution of the Britishers. The liberal egalitarian ideology under the British Raj, it created conditions for social awakening of women's groups. The social women's associations which we have, on most important of them, they already originated in the colonial period. Now, and these issues, they would talk about evil customs, social customs like parda, the child marriage, women's suffrage, and they wanted rights of enfranchisement and the right to stand for office. So if we just quickly go through the phases, the first phase, 1850 to 1915, it was an era in which efforts were, it was an era in which women were, actually women issues were being taken up by men. Then second phase, we had women only organizations which came up. In the third phase, then we had empowered women, enlightened women, and which put India on the international field. Now, if we look at the form of women's participation in movement, the forms have been that first is that they have talked about political, economic and social rights. Second is that they have asked for improvement in conditions of work and autonomy to women. Third agenda that they have asked for is for equal remuneration for work. And fourth is there are general issues related to family, the society in which women need to be uplifted. What have been the goals of women's movement? First has been the liberation or upliftment of women, and second major goal has been asking for equal rights for men and women. And the incentives to women's movement have been the Western education, the leadership provided by educated elite women, then benevolent attitude of political national leaders, they could be men or they could be women. And then by way of conclusion, I would like to say that the status of women has changed in terms of suffrage, in terms of status, and in terms of economic independence. Individual women have overcome obstacles with greater acclaim. Then the Millennium Development Goal also has made it compulsory for countries to bring about equality. And in final analysis, there are four things which emerge. That in India, the women from diverse castes, classes and communities have participated in the movement. Second, the activists were drawn from a variety of political trends, parties and groups and belong to different ideologies. The movement has been highly heterogeneous, and there has been a variety of positions, ideologies, strategies and mass bases which have involved the women's movement in India. So with this, I would like to conclude the lecture.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving such a productive session and making us aware of the various phases through which women has passed on. And in future lecture also, we would be learning more through you about the issues as well as the condition of women and her upliftment. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.